Chapter 2. Late to the party. How much longer? I've never known a scythe to be so impatient. Then you do not know many scythes. We are an impatient and irascible lot. Honorable Scythe Sidney Pozuelo of Amazonia was already present when Captain Yuriko Sobranis arrived on the bridge, just after dawn. Yuriko wondered if the man ever slept. Maybe so, it's hard people to sleep for them. Half a day at full speed, Yoriko answered. We'll be there by 6 p.m., just as I said yesterday, Your Honor. Pozuelo sighed. Your ship is too slow. Yoriko grinned. All this time, and now you're in a hurry. Time is never of the essence until someone decides that it is. Yoriko couldn't argue the logic. In the best of worlds, this operation would have happened a long time ago. To which Pozuelo responded, in case you haven't noticed, this is no longer the best of worlds. There was truth in that. At the very least, it was not the world that Yoriko had grown up in. In that world, the Thunderhead was a part of most everyone's life. It could be asked anything, it always answered, and its answers were precise, informative, and just as wise as they needed to be. But that world was gone. The Thunderhead's voice had gone silent now that human beings were all unsavory. Eureka had been marked unsavory once before, as a teenager. It wasn't hard to accomplish, just 3 instances of shoplifting from a local grocery. Eureka was smug about it for less than a day. Then the consequences began to set in. Being denied communication with the Thunderhead wasn't a big deal for Eureka, but there were other things about the experience that were irksome. Unsavories were last in line for food in the school cafeteria and were always left with the dishes no one else wanted. Unsavories were moved to the front of the classroom, where the teachers could keep a watchful eye on them. And while Yuriko wasn't cut from the soccer team, probational meetings were always scheduled in direct conflict with games. It was clearly intentional. Yuriko used to think the Thunderhead was being spitefully passive-aggressive, but in time, Yuriko came to realize that the Thunderhead was merely making a point. Unsavorism was a choice, and one must decide if the things lost were worth the things gained. Lesson learned. A taste of being unsavory was enough. It took 3 months of towing the line for the big red U to be removed from Yuriko's ID, and once it was gone, there was no desire to repeat the experience. I'm pleased your status has been lifted, the Thunderhead had said, once it was free to speak again. In response, Yuriko had told the Thunderhead to turn on the bedroom lights, because giving it an order put the Thunderhead back in its place. It was a servant. It was everyone's servant. It had to do as Yuriko commanded. There was comfort in that. And then came the schism between humanity and its greatest creation. Endurance sank into the sea, and the Thunderhead declared the entirety of humankind unsavory all in the same moment. At the time, no one exactly knew what the loss of the World Scythe Council would mean for people, but the Thunderhead's silence hurled the world into collective pain. Unsavorism was no longer a choice, it was now a judgment, and silence was all it took to turn servitude into superiority. The servant became the master, and the world became all about pleasing the Thunderhead. What can I do to lift this judgment? People cried. What can I do so that the Thunderhead finds favor in me once more? The Thunderhead never asked for adoration, yet people now gave it, creating elaborate hoops to jump through, hoping that the Thunderhead would take notice. Of course, the Thunderhead did hear the cries of humanity. It still saw everything, but now it kept its opinions to itself. Meanwhile, planes still flew. Ambu drones were still dispatched for people who went others. Food was still grown and distributed. The Thunderhead kept the world functioning in the same fine-tuned precision as before. It did what it saw fit for the human race as a whole. But if you wanted your desk lamp turned on, you had to do it yourself. Scythe Pozuelo stayed on the bridge, monitoring their progress for a bit longer. It was a smooth sailing, but smooth sailing was a monotonous endeavor, especially to one not accustomed to it. He left to take breakfast in his quarters, his forest green robe billowing behind him as he went down the narrow stairs toward the lower decks. Yuriko wondered what sort of things went through the Scythe's mind. Did he worry about tripping over his robe? Did he relive past gleanings, or was he merely thinking about what he'd have for breakfast? He's not a bad sort, said Wharton, the ship's deck watch officer, who had been in the position much longer than Yuriko had had command of the ship. I actually like him, said Yuriko. He's a lot more honorable than some of the other honorable sights I've come across. The fact that he chose us for this salvage says a lot. Yes, I'm just not sure what it says. I believe it says you chose your career path wisely. That was quite a compliment coming from Gordon, who was not a man giving over to flattery. But Yuriko couldn't take full credit for the decision. I just took the Thunderhead's advice. A few years earlier, when the Thunderhead had suggested Yuriko might be happy pursuing a life at sea, it had annoyed Yuriko no end. Because the Thunderhead was right. It had made a perfect assessment. Yuriko had already been thinking along those lines, but to hear the Thunderhead make the suggestion was like a spoiler to the story. Yuriko knew there were many seafaring lives to choose from. There were people who traveled the globe in search of the perfect wave to surf. Others spent their time racing sailboats or traversing oceans in tall ships modeled after vessels from bygone eras. But these were pastimes that served no practical purpose beyond the sheer joy of it. Jericho wanted a pursuit of happiness that was also functional, a career that added something tangible to the world. Marine salvage was the perfect ticket, and not just dredging up things the Thunderhead intentionally sent to provide work for the salvage industry. There was no better than children digging up plastic dinosaur bones in a sandbox. Jericho wanted to recover things that had truly been lost, and that meant developing a relationship with the Scythoms of the world, because while ships under the Thunderhead jurisdiction never met with untimely ends, Scythe vessels were prone to mechanical failure and subject to human error. Shortly out of secondary school, Jericho took a position as a junior apprentice with a second-rate salvage team in the western Mediterranean. Then, when Scythe Dali's yachts sank in shallow waters off the coast of Gibraltar, it gave Jericho an unexpected opportunity for advancement. Using standard diving gear, Jericho was one of the first to the wreck, and while the others were still surveying the scene, Jericho, against Captain's orders, went inside, found the body of the dead Scythe in his cabin, and brought him to the surface. Jericho was fired on the spot. No surprise. After all, it was mutinous to disobey a direct order, but it was part of a calculated move, because when Scythe Ali and his entourage were revived, the first thing the man wanted to know was who had pulled him from the sea. In the end, the Scythe was not only grateful, but exceptionally generous. He granted the entire salvage team a year of immunity from cleaning, but wanted to bestow something special on the one who had sacrificed everything to retrieve the body of the dead Scythe. For, clearly, that individual had their priorities in order. Scythe Ali asked what Jericho hoped to achieve in life. "I'd like to run my own salvage operation someday," Jericho told the Scythe, thinking that he might put in a good word. Instead, the Scythe brought Jericho to the E.L. Spence, a spectacular 100-meter Agor ship converted for marine salvage. "You shall be this vessel's captain," Dali proclaimed, and since the Spence already had a captain, the Scythe cleaned him on the spot. Then instructed the crew to be obedient to their new captain, or be clean themselves. It was, to say the least, very surreal. It was not the way Jericho had wanted to achieve command, but had no more choice in the matter than the lead captain. Realizing that the crew would not easily take orders from a 20-year-old, Jericho lied, professing to be 40-something, but having recently turned the corner, setting back to a more youthful self. Whether or not they believed it was their business. It took a long time for the crew to warm to their new captain. Some acted out in secret ways. The bout of food poisoning that first week, for instance, could likely be traced back to the cook. And although genetic testing would have determined precisely whose feces had found its way into Jericho's sauce, pursuing it wasn't worth the trouble. The Spence and its crew traveled the world. Even before Jericho's command, the salvage team had made a name for itself. But their new captain had the sense to hire a team of Tasmanian divers with dual-form breathers. Having a dive team that could breathe underwater, combined with a first-rate retrieval crew, made them sought after by sites around the world. And the fact that Jericho made retrieval of the dead his first priority over salvage of lost property gained them even greater respect. Jericho had raised Scythe Akhenaten's barge from the bottom of the Nile, retrieved Scythe Arkhart Deity's body from an ill-fated flight, and when Grandslayer Amundsen Pleasure ship sank in icy waters off the Ross Shelf region of Antarctica, the Spence was summoned to retrieve him. And then, Toward the end of Yoriko's first year of command, Endurance sank in the middle of the Atlantic, setting the stage for the greatest salvage operation in history. Yet the curtains of that stage remained resolutely closed. Without the Grandslayers of the World Scythe Council, there was no one in the world who could authorize a salvage, and with Goddard raving in North America that the perimeter of rivers not be breached, Endurance reigns remained in limbo. Meanwhile, various regional Scythedom that had aligned with Goddard patrolled the perimeter, gleaning anyone caught there. Endurance sank in water 2 miles deep, but it might as well have been lost in the space between stars. With all that intrigue, it had taken quite a while for any regional Scythedom to dredge up the nerve to attempt a salvage. And as soon as Amazonia declared its intention, others joined in. But since Amazonia was the first to stick its neck out, it insisted on being in charge. Other Scythedoms quacked, but no one denied Amazonia, mainly because it meant the region would bear the brunt of Goddard's anger. You do realize that our current heading is more than a few degrees of curse? Chief Wharton pointed out to the captain, now that Pozuelo was no longer on the bridge. We'll correct curse at none, Yoriko told him. It will delay our arrival by a few hours. Nothing more awkward than arriving too late in the day to begin operations, but too early to call it a night. Good thinking, sir, Wharton said, then took a quick glance outside and corrected himself. A bit evasively. I'm sorry, ma'am. My mistake. It was cloudy just a moment ago. No need to apologize, Wharton, Yoriko said. I don't care either way, especially on a day when there's as much sunshine as cloud cover. Yes, Captain, Wharton said. No disrespect intended. Yoriko would have smirked, but that would have been disrespectful to Wharton, whose apology, although unnecessary, was genuine. While it was a mariner's job to mark the position of the sun and stars, they were simply not accustomed to meteorological fluidity. Yoriko was from Madagascar, one of the world's 7 charter regions, where the Thunderhead employed different social structures to better the human experience, and people flocked to Madagascar because of the popular uniqueness of its mandate. All children in Madagascar were raised genderless and forbidden to choose a gender until reaching adulthood. Even then, many then chose a single state of being. Some, like Yoriko, found fluidity to be their nature. I feel like a woman beneath the sun and the stars. I feel like a man under the cover of clouds, Yoriko had explained to the crew when assuming command. A simple glance at the skies will let you know how to address me at any given time. It wasn't the fluidity that esteemed the crew. That was common enough. But they had trouble getting used to the meteorological aspect of Yoriko's personal system. Having been raised in a place where such things were the norm rather than the exception, it never even occurred to Yoriko that it could be an issue until leaving home. Some things simply made a person feel feminine, other things made a person feel masculine. Wasn't that true of everyone regardless of gender? Or did binaries deny themselves the things that didn't fit the mold? Well, regardless, Yoriko found the fox-pass and overcompensations more humorous than anything else. How many other salvage teams do you think will be there? Yoriko asked Wharton. Dozens, said Wharton. And more on the way. We're already late to the party. Yoriko dismissed the notion. Not at all. We're carrying the scythe in charge, which means we're the flagship of the operation. The party can't start until we get there, and I intend to make a grand entrance. I have no doubt of that, sir, said Wharton, because the sun had slipped behind a cloud. At sunset, the spans near the spot where the island of the Enduring Heart had sunk. There are 73 ships of various classes waiting just outside the perimeter of Reverence, Chief Wharton informed Captain Soberanis. Seth Pozuelo couldn't hide his disdain. They're no better than the sharks that devour the Grandslayers. As they began to pass the outermost vessels, Yoriko noted a shape much larger than the spans directly in their path. We'll plot a course around her, said Wharton. No, said Yoriko. Maintain our current heading. Wharton looked worried. We'll ram her. Yoriko gave him a wicked grin. Then she'll have to move. Pozuelo smiled. And this will make clear from the beginning who is in charge of this operation, he said. I like your instincts, Yuri. Wharton darted a glance at Yoriko. Out of respect, no one on the crew called their captain Yuri. That was reserved for friends and family, but Yoriko allowed it. The span surged forward at full speed, and the other ship did move, but only when it became clear that the spans would truly ram her if it didn't. It was a game of chicken handily won. Position us dead center, Jericho instructed as they crossed into the perimeter of reverence. Then notify the other ships that they can join us. At 6 a.m. tomorrow, salvage crews can begin sending drones down to survey the wreckage. Tell them that all information is to be shared, and anyone caught withholding information is subject to cleaning. Pozuelo raised an eyebrow. Are you speaking for the Scythom now, Captain? Just trying to ensure compliance, Yoriko said. After all, everyone's subject to cleaning, so I'm not telling them something they don't already know. I'm just putting it into a new perspective. Pozuelo laughed out loud. Your audacity reminds me of a junior scythe I used to know. Used to? Pozuelo sighed. Scythe Anastasia. She perished long ago with her mentor, Scythe Curie, when Endura sank. You knew Scythe Anastasia? Asked Yoriko, duly impressed. Yes, said Pozuelo, but all too briefly. Well, said Yoriko, perhaps whatever we raise from the depths can bring her some peace. We have wished Scythe Anastasius and Curie luck on their trip to Endura in the inquest against Goddard. I can only hope that the Grunnslayers, in their wisdom, will disqualify him, thereby ending his bid for Highblade. As for Munir and me, we must travel halfway around the world to find the answers we seek. My faith in this perfect world now hangs by the final thread of fraying tether. That which was perfect will not remain so for long. Not while our own flaws fill the cracks and crevices, eroding all that we have labored to create. Only the Thunderhead is beyond reproach, but I do not know its mind. I share none of its thoughts, for I am a scythe, and the Thunderhead's realm is beyond my reach, just as my solemn work is outside of its global jurisdiction. The founding scythes feared our own hubris, feared that we couldn't maintain the virtue, selflessness, and honor that our job as scythes requires. They worried that we might grow so full of ourselves, so bloated by our own enlightenment, that we would, like Icarus, fly too close to the sun. For more than 200 years, we have proved ourselves worthy. We have lived up to the grand expectations, but things have changed in the blink of an eye. There is, I know, a fail-safe left by the founding scythes, a contingency should the Scythedom fail. But if I find it, will I have the courage to take action? From the post-mortem journal of Scythe Michael Faraday, March 31st, Year of the Raptor. Chapter 3. An invigorating way to start one's week. On the day that Endura sank, a small, off-grid plane flew to a place that didn't exist. Munir Rose, a former night librarian at the Great Library of Alexandria, was the passenger. Scythe Michael Faraday was the pilot. I'd learned to pilot aircraft in my early years as a scythe, Faraday told her. I find that flying a plane is calming. It brings one's mind to a different, more peaceful place. That might work for him, but apparently didn't work for passengers, because every bump had Munira white-knuckling her seat. Munira was never a fan of air travel. Yes, it was perfectly safe, and no one had been known to be permanently killed by an airplane. The one post-mortal incident on record took place more than 50 years before she was born, involving a passenger liner that had the profoundly bad luck to be struck by a meteorite. The Thunderhead immediately ejected all the passengers to avoid the inevitable crash and burn. Instead, they were quickly rendered others by the rarefied air at cruising altitude. Within seconds, they were frozen solid by the cold and fell to the forest far below. Ambu drones were dispatched even before they landed, and recovered each and every body within an hour. They were brought to revival centers, and in a couple of days they happily boarded a new flight to their destination. An invigorating way to start one's week, one of the passengers had quipped in an interview. Be that as it may, Munira still did not like planes. She knew her fear was completely irrational, or at least it had been irrational until Scythe Faraday pointed out that once they crossed out of known airspace, they'd be on their own. Once we're in the Pacific blind spot, no one will be tracking us, not even the Thunderhead, Faraday told her. No one will know if we live or die. It meant that if they did have the bad luck of being struck by a meteorite, or met with some other unexpected catastrophe, no Ambu drones would arrive to airlift them to a revival center. They would stay dead just as permanently as mortals once did. just as irrevocably as if they were glint. It didn't help that the plane was being flown by Faraday instead of being allowed to fly itself. She trusted the vulnerable Scythe, but still he was, like everyone else, subject to human error. This was all her own fault. She was the one who had deduced that the Thunderhead had a blind spot in the South Pacific, a spot filled with islands, or more accurately, atolls, ridges of ancient volcanoes that now formed a series of circular island chains. This was an entire region hidden from the Thunderhead, and indeed the world, by the founding sites. The question was, why? Just 3 days ago, they had met with Scythe's Curie and Anesthesia to tell them of their suspicions. Be careful, Michael, Scythe Curie had said. The fact that Curie was concerned with what they had uncovered was troubling to Munira. Scythe Curie was fearless, and yet she feared for them. That was no small thing. Faraday, too, had his misgivings, but he chose not to share them with Munira. Better she see him as a stalwart. After that meeting, they had made their way, ever incognito, towards America using commercial transit. The rest of the way would be by private craft. They just had to get themselves a plane. While Faraday was entitled to take anything he wanted, no matter how large or who it belonged to, he rarely did so. It was always his objective to leave as small a footprint as possible on the lives of those he encountered. Unless, of course, his purpose was to glean them. In that case, his footprint would be definitive and heavy. He had not gleaned a single soul since faking his own death. As a dead man, he could not take life, because if he did, the Scythedom would be alerted, as the Scythedom database logged all cleanings by way of his ring. He had considered disposing of it, but chose not to. It was a matter of honor, a matter of pride. He was still a Scythe and would not disrespect the ring by parting with it. He found that he missed cleaning less and less as time went on. Besides, right now he had other things to do. Once in West America, they spent a day in Angel City, a place that, in mortal days, was the subject of much glittering fascination and personal misery. Now it was just a theme park. Then the following morning, Faraday donned his robe, which he hadn't worn much since slipping off the Scythedom's radar, went to a marina, and appropriated the best seaplane there, an 8-passenger amphibious jet. Make sure we have sufficient fuel source for a trans-Pacific journey, he told the manager of the marina. We intend to depart as soon as possible. Faraday was a formidable figure already without the rope. Munira had to admit that with his rope, he was commanding in a way that only the best sides are. I'll have to talk to the owner, the marina manager said with a quiver in his voice. No, Faraday calmly told him. You'll have to tell the owner after we've gone, as I have no time to wait. Inform that the craft shall be returned once I'm done with it, and I shall pay a sizable rental fee. Yes, Your Honor, said the man, for what else could he say to a scythe? While Faraday was alert at the controls, Munira kept checking to make sure he wasn't dozing or losing focus, and she counted every pocket of turbulence they hit on the way. 7 so far. If the Thunderhead controls weather, why doesn't it smooth out the flight channels? She gripped. It doesn't control weather, Faraday pointed out. The Thunderhead merely influences it, and besides, the Thunderhead cannot intervene for a scythe, no matter how much his esteemed associate despises Chopier. Munira appreciated that he did not refer to her as his assistant anymore. She had proved herself to be much more than that by finding the blind spot in the first place. Curse her own ingenuity. She could have happily stayed at the Library of Alexandria, none the wiser, but she had to be curious. And what was that old mortal age saying? Curiosity was a cat killer? As they flew over featureless Pacifics, a strange and sudden feedback began to wail over the radio. It was nearly deafening, and it lasted for almost a minute, even after Faraday had tried to turn it off. Munira felt her eardrums would burst from it, and Faraday had to let go of the controls just to cover his ears, which sent them churning wildly. Then the terrible sound stopped just as abruptly as it had begun. Faraday quickly regained control of the plane. What on earth was that? Munira asked, her ears still ringing. Faraday kept both hands on the controls, still getting over it himself. My guess is that it's some sort of electromagnetic barrier. I believe that means we've just crossed into the blind spot. Neither of them gave the noise much thought after that, and neither had any way of knowing that the same sound had been heard simultaneously all over the world, a sound that would come to be known in certain circles as the Great Resonance. It was the moment that marked the sinking of Endura, as well as the Thunderhead's global silence. But as Faraday and Munira were out of the Thunderhead's sphere of influence once they finally did cross into the blind spot, they remained unaware of anything in the outside world. From so high up, the submerged volcanic craters of the Marshall Atolls were clearly visible, massive lagoons within the dots and ribbons of the many islands that rimmed them. Look at all, Leaky at all. There were no buildings, no docks, no visible ruins at all to suggest that people had ever been there. There were many wilderness areas around the world, but those places were all meticulously maintained by the Thunderhead's Wilderness Corps. Even in the deepest, darkest forest, there were communication towers and embodrones, but should visitors find themselves seriously injured or temporarily killed. But out here, there was nothing. It was eerie. People lived here once, I'm sure, Faraday said, but the founding sites either cleaned them or, more likely, relocated them outside of the blind spot to keep all activities here as secret as possible. Finally, in the distance ahead, Quaya Lane Atoll came into view. So let's escape, due south of Wake, and make for the land of Nod, said Faraday, quoting the old nursery rhyme, and here they were, 700 miles due south of Wake Island, in the very center of the blind spot. Are you excited, Monera? Faraday asked, to know what Prometheus and the other founding sites know? To unravel the riddle they left for us? There's no warranty we'll find anything, Monera pointed out. Always the optimist. As all sites know, the founding sites claim to have prepared a fail-safe for society, should their whole concept of the Scythom not succeed. An alternative solution to the immortality problem. No one took it seriously anymore. Why should they, when the Scythom had been the perfect solution for a perfect world for over 200 years? No one cared about a failsafe until something failed. If Scythe's Korean anesthesia were successful on Enduro, and Scythe Korea became the high blade of Mid-America, perhaps the Scythom could be torn from the ruinous path Goddard would take it on. But if not, the world just might need a failsafe. They dropped to 5,000 feet, and as they approached, details of the atoll became into view. Lush groves and sandy beaches, the main island of Kwajalein Atoll was shaped like a long, slender boomerang, and here they finally saw something that was evident nowhere else in the blind spot. Telltale signs that there had once been a human presence here. Strips of low growth that used to be roads, foundations outlining spots where buildings once stood. Jackpot, said Faraday, and pushed the stick forward, dropping their altitude for a closer look. Monira could actually feel her nanites registering her relief. At last, all was well, until the moment that it wasn't. Unregistered aircraft, please identify. It was an automated message barely audible through waves of powerful interference, with a generated voice that sounded too human to actually be human. Not to worry, Faraday said, then transmitted the universal identification code used by the Scythom. A moment of silence, and then, unregistered aircraft, please identify. This is no good, said Monira. Faraday threw her a half-hearted scowl, then spoke into the transmitter again. This is Scythe Michael Faraday of Mid-America, requesting permission to approach the main island. Another moment of silence, and then the voice said, Scythe ring detected. Both Faraday and Monira relaxed. There, said Faraday. All better now. Then the voice spoke again. Unregistered aircraft, please identify. What? I said I'm Scythe Michael Faraday. Scythe not recognized. Of course it won't acknowledge you, Monira told him. You weren't even born when the system was put in place. It probably thinks you're an imposter with a stolen ring. Blast. Which is exactly what the island did. A laser pulse shot out from somewhere on the island and took out their left engine with a reverberating boom that they could feel in their bones, as if they had been struck and not the plane. This was everything that Munira had feared, the culmination of all her worst-case scenarios, and yet, in spite of that, she found courage and clarity in the moment that she hadn't expected to find. The plane had a safety pod, Munira had even checked it before takeoff just to make sure it was in working order. "The pod shaft," she told Faraday. "We have to hurry." "This is," said Michael Faraday. "It's a machine," Munira reminded him. "And not a very smart one. It can be reasoned with." The proof of that was a second shot that shattered the windshield and set the cockpit on fire. At a higher altitude they would have been sucked out, but they were low enough to be spared from explosive decompression. "Michael!" yelled Munira, using his first name, which he had never done before. "It's no use." Their wounded craft had already begun a lopsided dive toward the sea. There was no saving the plane now, not even by the most skilled of pilots. Finally, Faraday gave up, left the cockpit, and together they fought the angle of the diving jet to reach the safety pod. They climbed inside but couldn't pull it closed, because his rope kept getting caught in the latch. "Damn this thing," he growled, and tugged so hard that the hem ripped, but the latch was now free. The mechanism sealed them inside. Dual foam expanded to fill the remaining space, and the pod ejected. The safety pod had no window, so there was no way to see what was going on around them. There was nothing but a sense of extreme dizziness as the pod tumbled free from the crushing plane. Munira gasped as needles penetrated her body. She knew they were coming, but still it was a shock. They caught her in at least 5 places. "I despise that part," groaned Faraday, who, having lived as long as he had, must have experienced a safety pod before, but it was all new and horrifying to Munira. Safety pods were specifically designed to render the subjects within unconscious, so that anyone who was injured by the pod's landing would remain unconscious while their own nanites healed them. Then they would awaken unscathed after however many hours it took to repair their damage. And if death occurred, then they'd be whisked to a revival center. Like those passengers in the meteor strike, they would wake up and feel exhilarated by it all. Except that would not happen to Munira and Faraday way out here, if the fall killed them. "If we die," said Faraday, his words already slurring, "I am truly sorry, Munira." She wanted to respond, but found herself slipping out of consciousness before she could. There was no sense of time passing. One moment, Munira was tumbling in darkness with Faraday, and the next, she was looking up at swaying palm trees that shaded her from the sun. She was still in the pod, but the lid had popped open, and she was alone. She sat up, rolling out of the form-fitting foam. Near the tree line, Faraday roasted a fish on a stick over a small fire, and drank coconut water straight from the coconut. A bit of torn line trailed from his rope in the sand, the spot where it had caught on the latch. The hem was muddy. It seemed odd to see the great scythe Michael Faraday in a robe that wasn't pristine and perfect. "Ah," he said jovially, "you're awake at last." He handed her the coconut for a sip. "A miracle we survived," she said. Only when she smelled the fish he was roasting did she realize how hungry she was. The pod was designed to keep its occupants hydrated for days, but provided no actual nutrition. Her hunger attested to the fact that they had been there healing within the pod for at least a day or two. "We almost didn't survive," Faraday told her, giving her the fish and skewering another. "According to the pod's record, there was a failure of the parachute, probably hit by a piece of debris, or it took a laser strike. We hit the water hard, and in spite of the foam padding, we both suffered grade 3 concussions and multiple rib fractures. You also had a ruptured lung, which is why it took a few more hours for your nanites to heal you than mine." The pod, which had a propulsion system for a water landing, had powered them safely to shore and was now half buried in the sand, having endured 2 days of rising and falling tides. Munira glanced around, and Faraday must have read the look on her face, because he said, "Oh, don't worry. The defensive system apparently only tracks incoming craft. The pod can come close enough to the island not to be noticed." As for their plane, the one Faraday had promised to return to its owner, it was now in pieces at the bottom of the Pacific. "We are officially castaways," Faraday said. "Then why are you so damn happy?" "Because we're here, Munira. We did it. We have achieved something that no one since the birth of the post-mortal age has achieved. We've found the land of Nod." The Kwajalein atoll seemed like a small place from the sky, but now that they were on the ground, it felt massive. The main island wasn't very wide, but seemed to stretch on forever. There was evidence of old infrastructure everywhere, so hopefully what they were looking for would be here, and not on one of the outlying islands. The problem was they didn't know what, exactly, they were looking for. They explored for days, slowly zigzagging back and forth across the island from dawn until dusk, keeping a record of the relics they found, and there were relics everywhere. The broken pavement of roads that had long since given way to a new growth forest, stone foundations that had once supported buildings, tumbled piles of rusted iron and worn steel. They dined on fish and wildfowl, which were plentiful on the island, as were whimsically varied fruit trees that were clearly not indigenous. Most likely they had been cultivated in backyards, and were still here long after the homes and yards had gone. "What if we don't find anything?" Munira had asked early into their exploration. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," he said. "There are no bridges," she reminded him. For the first few days, aside from the stubby defensive tower, which had sealed itself shut like some vertical sarcophagus, they had found little more than broken porcelain from old sinks and toilets, and plastic containers that would probably remain there uncharged until the sun went over and devoured the inner planets. This place might be a mecca for archaeologists, but it brought the pair no closer to finding what they had come for. Then, toward the end of the first week, they crested a burn to find the sand-covered expanse too geometric to be natural. Just a little bit of shallow digging revealed a layer of concrete so thick that barely anything had taken root in it. There was a sense of purpose to the place, although they couldn't tell what that purpose might have been. And there, against the side of the berm, almost entirely hidden by vines, was a moss-covered doorway, the entrance to a bunker. As they cleared the vines away, they found a security panel. Anything written or etched into it had been eroded away, but what remained told the only tale it needed to tell. The panel had an indentation that was the exact size and shape as the gem on a scythe ring. "I've seen this before," said Faraday. "In older scythe buildings, our rings would serve as entry, I guess. They actually used to have a purpose beyond granting immunity and looking impressive." He raised his fist and pressed his ring to the indentation. They could hear the mechanism unlatch, but it took the two of them to force the old doors open. They had brought flashlights that had been among the scant supplies in the safety pod. Now they shined them into the musty darkness as they entered a corridor that angled downward at a steep slope. The bunker, unlike the island, was untouched by time, save for a fine layer of dust. A single wall had cracked, and roots pushed forth like an ancient tentacled creature forcing slow entry, but other than that, the outside wall remained outside. Finally, the corridor opened into a space with multiple workstations, old screens of antique computer consoles. It reminded Munira of the secret room beneath the Library of Congress where they had found the map that led them here. That place had been cluttered, but this one was left in perfect order. Chairs were pushed against desks as if by a cleaning crew. A coffee mug from a place that bore the name of a Herman Melville character sat beside a workstation, as if waiting for someone to fill it. This place hadn't been abandoned in a hurry. In fact, it hadn't been abandoned at all. It had been prepared, and Munira couldn't shake the uncanny feeling that whoever had left it this way over 200 years ago knew they were coming.
An open response to His Excellency Highblade Tenkamenin of Subsahara. I categorically refuse to honor your unethical and offensive restriction of American scythes. I will not now, nor ever, acknowledge the right of any Highblade to banish my scythes from any region. As I'm sure your own parliamentarian will tell you, scythes have free rein to travel the world over, and can glean whomever they see fit, whenever and wherever they see fit to do it. Therefore, any restriction placed has no validity, and any region that joins Sub-Sahara in this wretched endeavor shall see an influx of Mid-American scythes, if only to make my point. Be warned that any action taken against my scythes in your region will be responded to in kind and swiftly.
Respectfully, Honorable Robert Goddard, Highblade of Mid-America.